All right, welcome back to the Veterinary Ledger Podcast. This is the show where finance meets the exam room. Each episode, Meghan and I are diving into real numbers, strategies, and stories behind building a stronger, more profitable veterinary practice. I'm real excited today for today's conversation. We have the principal economist from Stantec, Patrick Luce, and Jeremy Bess. Guys, thanks for joining the show today.
Boy, thank you all for having us.
Thanks for having us.
You know, it's a lot to have one economist do anything. You have two, and that might be just way over the top.
And we put ourselves in two separate rooms so that, we're not just screaming across each other. But the problem is we do share a wall, so I might just, pound on it a little
like
bit.
You're kind of in the same room, but that's okay.
Yeah, he's right there.
We're going to drill a hole in the wall one day.
I love that, Pastor. So I will say, I met you guys. You guys presented at the Veterinary Hospital Managers Association's annual conference this year. You talked about navigating the economy. It was early in the morning, but you guys held the audience, which was great. I kind of feel like, it's like the Chandler Bing of the world. I don't quite understand what you do, but you guys talked about vet med and money, and we were all like wrapped with attention and paying attention. So I feel like you guys emphasized a lot the modest growth and the sticky inflation for 2026. What does that mean?
Yeah, fundamentally. So what we do is we look at the world around us, right? This whole big picture of the macroeconomy. And we say, well, gosh, what does growth look like for output and retail spending? And what does inflation look like for consumers and producers across industries? And they say, well, what's going on with the labor market and money and interest rates? We triangulate all these things and they say, well, all right, now we're going to peek out into the future. We want to plan precisely what's coming at us, not based upon what has happened, but what the future is suggesting based on leading indicators. And so what it is suggesting is modest growth. And I think that's something that we've heard a lot of whiplash in, say, Wall Street Journal or all the periodicals that come out and say, well, recession odds are 70%. Now they're 30%. Now they're 80%. Now they're 20%. That's not good for planning. And so we are talking about modest levels of economic growth heading out to the remainder of 2025 and even into 2026. And when we say modest, we're not talking about running around with our hair on fire. We're not talking about trying to return to 2021, 2022, when we couldn't keep up with demand, but we are talking about opportunity. And there is a lot of signals out there that suggest that businesses are going to feel a little bit more momentum as the rest of the year wanes and into 2026. We've had a bit of, sluggish late 24, sluggish 2025, and we see the bottom showcasing itself. And now we're looking at growth. And that's kind of my spiel on the output and the retail sales and the production. But I don't want to steal too much thunder because Jeremy gets impatient when I spend too much time talking. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the inflation side.
No, it's, listen, when we're talking about modest economic growth, which is what Patrick says, right? We have to go back to our, or maybe our textbook supply and demand charts. And we say, well, geez, an increase in demand is going to come with some, level of, increase in pricing or inflation. But we've already been seeing that, right? Last year, late in 2024, we were saying we're likely to hit a bottom in inflation, meaning a low point in inflation by mid-2025. And we're already seeing that, right? We've seen multiple months of inflation rising in the second half, despite, the Fed saying, oh, well, now we should start pulling interest rates down, which, by the way, only benefits the consumer next year and the year after. But we're starting to see, inflation come around, and that's partly driven by that demand piece. And I'll be clear, to maybe piggyback off of what Patrick was saying, I think it's been a bit of a challenge in 2025 to convince folks that we're going to end this year with growth, the world's not falling apart, and to be planning for 2026, And I think that has a lot to do with so much noise right now in a lot of different media, outlets. And maybe we're being inundated with data points and all these things, but our job is to really, read through all of that and say, well, here are the data points that support this more often than not. We need to start preparing ourselves for growth, or as business leaders, we're going to have to play catch up. And then a lot of times it's not even catch up. You'll just miss that opportunity because business cycles ebb and flow. And all of a sudden, if you don't act quick enough, right, you're going to be left, standing and missing out on those opportunities. So yes, a little bit of demand pickup that comes with resumed inflation. We're not talking about the 2022 peaks. We're not talking about 1980s. right? But we are talking about 3-4% over the next couple years, which is higher than what we were maybe dealing with in the 2010s, which is what folks were kind of so used to for a while there.
How much of that though is bad economics masked or hidden by this boom and rise in AI? And is that clouding or leading to more of the artificial or real growth that there is? Or no, it's just a part of the puzzle.
Well, listen, when I think about macroeconomic growth, we can maybe forget for just a minute the big broad one that's GDP, right? Gross domestic product. It's like the broadest level of measurement that a country can, express at. And if we just push that away just for a minute, because it gets muddy, right? Especially when you start talking about the import-export dynamics that have been shaken up in 2025 a bit. And we look more at just producing widgets, right? And we think about that production side. We start looking at that, we say, well, production's rising already. It's actually in growth mode. But yes, part of that would be on the technical side of production. And that has a bit to do with, semiconductor chip making, so on and so forth. So sure, that has a bit to do with growth expectations. We're seeing that. But I don't want to just say, well, that's the only thing that's growing. That's what's pulling everything up. Like, no, the consumer is spending as well, which means when the consumer spends, we need to make widgets and goods and produce those things for that demand. And so we're seeing it in a lot of, different, all durable goods, for example, looking pretty darn good. Non-durable goods getting pulled back with a little bit on the commodity side, but still not falling off a cliff. And then again, like Patrick mentioned, retail sales, just a broad barometer of is the U.S. consumer spending. Holy mackerel, we've had multiple months that would suggest cyclical rise is already been in place and will continue as we head into 2026. So I don't want it to be masked fully by the AI or high-tech space. That's getting a little bit more of that media attention right now.
So a bit loosening of the wallets is what I hear, which is always good, right? Because if we're willing to spend money, then we're willing to spend money on our pets.
Yes.
Okay,
Exactly.
perfect.
And so kind of piggybacking off of that commentary, I think what we're dialing into is there are so many mixed signals out there that kind of makes, when you kind of mix all these colors together, like blue and purple and green, it turns into brown. And it's like, well, what color is that actually? And so that's what Jeremy's trying to do. Like, well, what color is the economy? And so we are talking about just output increase. We're talking about retail sales increasing. We talk about consumption in the veterinary space also showcasing signs of lift. And that's one thing where we have seen waning real consumer spending on veterinary services that has really not been experienced for a bit, where real spending on vet services went negative this past year. And it's really important. I know Jeremy and I can come in and talk about all these outlooks. It's important to think, well, what does that mean we should be thinking about? What should we be doing? How do we sustain demand? How do we really capture client loyalty despite, tighter household budgets, despite the resumption of inflationary pressures? Can we be looking at introducing tiered service packages to kind of hit the essentials or standards or premiums? Can we look at expanding preventative and subscription-based plans? Can we look to enhance client education and communication, because where we are triangulating that resumed rise in spending with also resumed rise in inflationary pressures. And so we need to think through how can we contend with those competing challenges?
I think, back in the early 1900s, if we just go back that far, sorry, I have to nerd out maybe just for a minute, right? Irving Fisher started talking about what's called the money illusion, which is the idea that, maybe as consumers, our wages don't compete with the overall inflationary environment. So if inflation's at 5%, I'm only getting a wage increase of 4%. That's a problem, right? But we can start drilling into that even more just shortly after that, who got probably more credit for that, which was another economist, John Maynard Keynes. Again, I have to nerd out just for a minute here. He started coining that a lot, and he started saying, hey, the money illusion's real for businesses. And that's the idea that inflation can mask some of those profitability issues. So you can have real revenue growth, but profitability could be negative. And that's that money illusion. And that's why Patrick was talking about, real veterinarian service, expenditures, right? Real just meaning let's remove inflation from it. Because if you didn't, that figure's positive right now. But if you, strip inflation out for a minute, it's slightly negative. So we're talking about momentum as we head out of this year and into 2026. But again, we're not talking about a lot of growth, mixed with some high inflationary pressures, there is a chance that as business owners in the vet space, you could be, losing profitability despite seeing that resurgence in revenue again.
Wow, I think you just hit on something, because that is always something we talk about is, yes, revenue is growing, but you have so much margin erosion, your profitability is not there. What should be the framework for that practice owner on how they think about their team and their people? Because everyone wants to, compensate better and pay more, but it feels as though those numbers are also kind of skewing the bottom line.
Boy, we just get so excited when we talk about this stuff.
We do get excited.
It is about protecting your margins. It is about knowing your data. I think a lot of practitioners and a lot of folks get so caught up in the day-to-day, and it's hard to take the moment to zoom out and truly know how your practice is performing. You need to look at your traffic into the practice, and are you growing your traffic? You got to look at the ticket sales for each one of those, and you need to juxtapose that with your cost pressures and try and make sure that you're taking action today to protect yourself, protect your margins, make sure you're improving your operational stability, because the rising input costs are something that we're going to continue to face. And we haven't even talked about the labor market from that perspective, but I'm sure we'll absolutely get there. But it does mean that you all need to focus on conducting regular pricing review. Make sure that you're adjusting prices incrementally and transparently, not ripping off Band-Aid all at once, but doing slow, steady drips and being very transparent about it, because those cost pressures are so prevalent. Maybe you can look into optimizing some of your, practice stability or metrics that you're tracking, whether it's looking at inventory management or looking at time to complete a service or looking at all these measures that could potentially be automated away, right? Can we look at automating some of those administrative functions to help, soften some of those labor pressures? Maybe we don't need to hire that new admin if we can implement digital invoicing and scheduling and reminders to help kind of strike a balance, because it's not easy, right? It is a very busy world out there. I think more so than what we were maybe dealing with prior to, say, COVID. And so taking action is the fundamental thing to make sure that you're zooming out and understanding your data. And I know it's hard when you're in the day-to-day and you're just kind of going through and making sure that you're putting out all the fires and spinning all of the plates, but it is important to focus on data. I know that's coming from a data nerd.
We want to be, no one likes a two-handed economist, because they say, like, on one hand this and on the other hand this, but on that piece, we're talking about saving labor hours, but I want to be clear, in order to drive your business, you have to invest in development, right? You have to invest in your people. I saw a funny meme the other day, and it was, this, old rowboat, and it was a bunch of people sitting in the front, and they were, wearing suits, and they must be the C-suite of the boat, right? And they were talking to each other going, how are we not going faster? And then they looked in the back of the boat, and there's just one guy rowing. All right, and he's rowing the entire crew of people. And it struck me, because it was like, that's exactly right. Everyone always goes, well, if we have tight margins, we need to pull back on labor one way or another. And I always go, sure, except we're talking about, a tighter marketplace. And so if you're trying to beat what's happening in the macro, you're going to need people to do it, right? So it becomes a bit of a challenge to say, well, what can we save on? And so I'm not really saying, hey, listen, we need to cut a full job, right? But maybe what I can do is free up enough time so that the person that I did free up time with has way more ability to focus on what they're really good at, right? And that only drives the profit, only drives down through the P&L. So again, a little bit of a cloudy economic, discussion here, that we're trying to constantly say, listen, you have to cut costs, but there are places you should not do it from. People are your business, so.
It's never very popular when you say, oh, you need to cut costs, choose on the chopping block, right? I think never a good way to start a conversation. So you're talking about a lot of things that we can be doing. Are there leadership traits or decision-making skills or something that you've seen that kind of lends itself to stay successful when the economy is doing what it's doing?
You can fundamentally focus on leading with positivity, leading with optimism, and making sure that you are staying in front and kind of being a champion of your business. It's that culture that's so important. And if you're leading with pessimism, you're leading with negativity, you're talking about cuts, it just ripples through. And as Jeremy mentioned, the people are fundamentally, in our opinion, is the most important part of a business. So focusing in on that workplace culture, whether it's recognition open communication, making sure that you're building loyalty, trying to reduce those turnover costs. And again, the investments into automating those functions to help your team, right? To kind of loosen some of their load, because I think a lot of folks in an administrative practice or in a practice are wearing a lot of hats. How can we make their lives easier? And that's fundamental to kind of being that positive, that leader that's kind of carrying the team forward and making sure that ripples through the entire culture.
I think too, if we have a better understanding on where we are going, then you can lead with optimism in any phase of the business cycle. And what I mean by that is if I knew we were coming with some downside pressure this year in 2025, okay, I was supposed to be gearing up for that in 2024. So the strongest leaders are those that are thinking about that forward look and not reacting to maybe what happened in the rear view. I had a great mentor who, was a hockey player, as a matter of fact. And then, he was telling me, he says, Jeremy, you got to stop celebrating the highs too highs and the lows too lows, right? Even keel. And you start thinking about that riding the highs and lows, you start thinking about business cycles. Well, how can I be more even keel? Well, I need to know where we're going. And then I don't have to have these, gut reactions. And don't get me wrong, right? Celebrating the wins are important, but making sure that, the growth I may have had a couple years ago was put into context. That doesn't mean that's going to last forever, because that's how we start over leveraging, right? And that's when we say, oh, I brought on too many people and now I have to make that really tough decision to let someone go. If we have that better understanding of saying, no, we're going to hold tight right now because we got to tighten our bootstraps a bit, or our wallets, right, as we head into 25. And I'm not necessarily saying that fully as we head in the next couple of years, because I do see more signs of economic growth. But again, to Patrick's point, how we can lead with optimism is trying to understand what's coming at us, not what already happened.
I think you both said a bunch of good things there, Patrick. What I picked up on is that turnover cost. I think it's often misunderstood and forgotten about, and it's just whoever I replace salary A with salary B, and that's my cost. And you lose all that built up knowledge and skill set and glue and stickiness within the practice when you do have a revolving door. And then Jeremy, what you said there on assuming or expecting kind of 2 years ago to replicate itself. Hey, we went through 13 to 15% growth. That's going to be our starting point for 2026. That framework is really hard to kind of not hold on to, especially when you get used to seeing a couple of years of back-to-back growth like that.
Yeah, we work with a lot of clients, and this is what Pat and I do, right? We talk about how we can forecast the macro, but in reality, our belief is that what's going on around us has an impact on the individual business. And so we do stress testing. That's exactly what our job is to do, to provide leaders with, a number that's not just built internally. It's saying, well, hey, are we swimming upstream or downstream? And that stress testing allows us to say, okay, what if we didn't hit double-digit levels of growth? What if, it was negative? How would we react? What do we need to pull? And getting prepared for that allows you to say, okay, well, when it happens, that's the lever I'm pulling. That allows me to know exactly what I'm going to do today because I planned for it. And I think there needs to be more of that, because the word uncertainty is not going away. So chaos is scary. Uncertainty just means I need to be better prepared for different, likelihoods.
So Jeremy, can you give some specifics? Like, is that, squirreling away some extra monies or keeping product lean? Like, what does that actually look like in a day-to-day practice?
Well, and then again, don't want to sound like, well, it depends, but let me just give you an example, because I think, well, it's not the one hand or the other. It's that it sometimes sounds counterintuitive. And I'll say this because right now, folks might be feeling that downside pressure on the backside of a business cycle that we felt earlier this year. Park what I'm already saying is coming, but that is the point at which folks say, well, I need to make sure I'm putting money away now, or I'm saving, I'm cutting costs, I'm not making big investments because I'm a bit nervous. And in reality, what we're saying is, oh, hey, things are going to pick back up. That's the exact time that you want to take that opportunity, right? For a couple different reasons. One, you could probably buy low, right? So you're kind of locking in contracts where other folks are not doing. So contractually that works. And then I think what ends up happening is some of these investments that we're making take some time to implement. Oh my gosh, the last time I want to make a really big investment to get all of my folks, to be trained up on different software, what have you, it's when we're really busy. I actually want to do it when there's time to breathe, which is actually what we're experiencing right now. And so it really, again, depends, because sometimes it just feels counterintuitive. Oh my gosh, you want me to invest and spend when things are negative year over year? And I say, yeah, because things are going to get less negative tomorrow and positive by the end of, or by, heading into 2026. So it's that timing piece. But to that point of savings, then yeah, right, we should have squirreled a bit away, right, when we were at the top of the business cycle a couple years ago. Right? That would have been the time to say, let's get prepared for that downside pressure. Or better yet, let's get prepared so that I can make a big investment without having to go to the bank at that time dealing with some higher interest rates.
I know I want to be mindful of everyone's time here as we think, though, on planning, right? Because you're talking mid-2026. That gives us 12 months or less. How far in advance should a practice owner be preparing? Is it unrealistic? Is it not worth looking 3-5 years down the road? Is, this doom and gloom in the 2030s? Do we brace for it, or do we just live within a 12 to 24-month window?
I think, Jeremy, I'd like to break it down into really 3 windows of planning. You have the near term, what's happening within a year. We have a better line of sight as to the headwinds or tailwinds that are emerging in that year, and we can be more specific, more precise with our planning within that year. Should we be investing in staff development and career pathing right now? Should we be exploring due diligence for a new ERP system, or should we be making investments into due diligence for market studies, into deploying into new regions or new territories? That's kind of like that near term. And then if you think about the medium term, it's kind of, considering when the right time is to maybe enact on some of those bigger strategic opportunities. The medium term, more like 2-3 years out. And we can think about, well, what tends to lead the economy in that 2 to 3 year window? And it can be the housing market. It can be the population migration. It can be the interest rate environment that can give suggestions for that 2 to 3 years out. And then we can go even further into the future and talk 3, 5, 10 years into the future. And we can think, well, what's more structural about an economy? And we can talk about demographics, and we can talk about a top heavy demographic where we have an aging population. And it's, in the US, it's not as bad as other countries like, say, Japan or Germany. But what can we be doing to prepare for that aging demographic, whether from a pet ownership standpoint or a labor standpoint? What can we be doing to prepare for just a stickier inflationary environment that we do expect to persist for the remainder of the decade when you factor in some of these more structural challenges, whether it's the demographic shifts or the deficit spending and some of these bigger, more, again, structural components? And then I think the big one for us is thinking about productivity and the adoption of new technologies like AI. What can we be doing? Because it's not going to go away. It's like the internet. If we went back in 1995 and said, it's just a fad, boy, we would have been so behind the curve. And so how can we start thinking about integrating some of those emerging technologies, again, to improve the efficiency and quality care? Because at the end of the day, if you're not, it's very likely that someone else is and you're falling behind. And so I think we break down planning into those 3 cycles: the short term, the here and now, what should I be doing strategically to get ready for the next 6 to 12 months, the medium term, and then the long term. So I think it's very prudent to kind of think through the planning. And obviously plans are made to be moldable. And as the winds somewhat change and give us different guidance, you should have that stress testing that Jeremy was talking about in place for those longer term strategic initiatives.
I think if I can just add one very quick comment is, Jared, when someone asks me, hey, should they be doing that? I think I'll throw it back right at them and say, well, I need to hear your goals, right? What are we talking about? Are you talking about retiring in the next 4 or 5 years? I'm going to have a very different discussion around how important it is to be planning right this minute. Whereas if you're, listen, I plan on growing and buying businesses over the next 10 years. Well, I'm going to say, okay, great. Like, we need to focus in on those purchases over the next year, the 2 years, because that's going to be way more important to you. You're going to go through multiple business cycles at that point. It's maybe less of a concern. You're going to deal with ebbs and flows. Whereas, the timing of this last hurrah of saying, I'm going to pass this on to someone or I'm going to sell. And so I think that's the question I would immediately throw back to someone, is just to say, it matters on what your goal is, and then that will gear exactly how you need to be planning. But I agree with Pat, thinking about it in chunks takes a little bit of the stress off of, an overload of decision making.
I appreciate your guys' knowledge of VetMed. Who would benefit from reaching out from you? Like, is it people who are buying, people who are selling, just somebody who needs some help navigating through their business? Like, what's your sweet spot for who you can help, and where can they find you?
I think fundamentally, it is all stages. If you are in the position of leading an organization, leading a team, leading a business, running a practice, you need to be thinking about what you're being confronted with, where we're all impacted in a different way from the economic space. And so if you are looking to buy a practice, well, yeah, we should be talking about where and when. If you're looking to sell a practice, that timing becomes even more important. Like, when do we want to sell? Well, we want to sell high, not sell low. And so that timing conversation was very important. Then if you're just talking about just general business planning, well, gosh, wouldn't it be important to know what's going to be going on with wages? How do we forecast the inflationary pressures that you might be feeling? What sorts of demand should you expect to be receiving from the macroeconomic space, Jeremy? And I say it all the time, we can come up with a forecast for a practice, but it is market driven. Our job is to help you beat that market driven expectation, not to just ride the ebbs and flows of the economy. And so we fundamentally see ourselves fitting in a role with anyone that's trying to better plan for the future.
Yeah. And I would say, if you want to reach out to us, you reach out to Patrick at midnight. That's when he gets his best forecast done. And that's patrick.luce at stantec.com. Or if you want to do it at a polite hour, marketeconomics@stantec.com is our team's shared email address. And we're always around. We're happy to have those conversations, even if it's just to pick our brain. We know how chaotic things can be, and it's hard to really, take action. So we're there to help, and we're there to give as much guidance as we can. And we absolutely appreciate the ability to talk with you both today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. This was great.
We appreciate it. Patrick, Jeremy, thank you both.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.